The sun was sinking behind the jagged hills of New Mexico when Jonah McCall noticed the buzzards circling lower than usual. The sky glowed orange and red, burning behind the silhouettes of dry mesquite and saguaro. It had been another scorching day on his failing ranch. The well had barely coughed up enough water to wet the tongue, and the cattle had grown thinner with each week. Jonah, a man hardened by loss and years of solitude, sat on the porch sharpening his knife in the stillness, with nothing but the wind and dust for company. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and the closest town might as well have been 100. No one came out this far, unless they were desperate or dangerous. That was when he saw the figure. At first, he thought it was a coyote crawling toward the fence, its legs barely working. But as it came closer, the shape took on the form of a man, a tall one, barefoot, shirtless, stumbling through the sand like every bone in his body had been shattered. Jonah stood, narrowed his eyes, and reached for the rifle propped beside the door. He didn't call out, he just watched. Caution had been carved into him by life's cruel hand. But something felt different this time. There was no aggression in the man's posture, no weapon in his hand. Just the slow, pained lurch of someone too far gone to be a threat. The man collapsed just short of the wooden gate, hitting the dirt hard. Jonah approached slowly, rifle still in hand. Up close, he could see the blood thick and dark seeping from a jagged wound across the stranger's side. Flies buzzed around it. The man's skin was copper-toned, burned by the sun, and his long black hair was caked with sweat and dust. There was a broken feather tied to a strip of leather at his wrist. His eyes fluttered open as Jonah leaned in. Brown, defiant, but exhausted. Not the eyes of a killer but of someone who had been hunted. Apache. Jonah single quotes as grip tightened around the rifle. Old instincts and older fears crawled up from his spine. The stories told around campfires. The warnings etched into every settler's mind. His father would have pulled the trigger without hesitation. His neighbors would have strung the man up just for breathing on their land. But Jonah stood there, torn between the past and the present. The man lying in the dirt hadn't come with a weapon. He'd come with wounds. Jonah stared down at him and saw not an enemy, but a soul fighting to survive. The rancher let out a breath. He didn't know he was holding and slung the rifle back over his shoulder. Damn fool, he muttered to himself, or the man. It wasn't clear. He bent down, hooked the Apache's arm over his own shoulders, and with a grunt, hauled the man to his feet. The stranger groaned, his weight nearly toppling them both. Step by step, Jonah carried him toward the house, kicking the door open with a boot and lowering him near the cold hearth. The room was dark and musty. A pot of stale beans sat over the coals. The floor creaked beneath Jonah's boots as he tore an old towel into strips and pressed them against the wound. The bleeding was slow now, but the gash was deep. He did what he could, boiled some water, cleaned the wound, and wrapped the man as best as any untrained hand could. The stranger's chest rose and fell in shallow waves. His lips cracked from thirst. Jonah brought over a tin cup with the last of the clean water and tipped it to the Apache's mouth. The man sipped, coughed, then closed his eyes again. There was barely enough food in the pantry for one man, let alone two. A half loaf of stale bread, a pinch of beans, a strip of venison from last week's hunt. Jonah looked at the meager offerings, hunger gnawing at his own belly. Then he divided it without thinking, without pausing. He set the larger portion beside the Apache. No words, no expectations. Outside, the coyotes howled. Inside, the fire cracked. Jonah sat back in his old chair and stared at the man he'd pulled from the desert. He didn't know who he was, where he came from, or whether this kindness would cost him everything. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had chosen to save a life. And the desert, though quiet, was already listening. The ranch house had never felt so still. Jonah McCall sat by the hearth, the wounded Apache wrapped in old blankets nearby, his breath shallow and uneven. Shadows crawled across the walls like silent whispers as the fire dimmed into a faint glow. The silence wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, thick in the air, like the pause before a coming storm. Jonah had lived through gunfights, droughts, and death. He had watched his parents buried beneath that same desert soil, but something about tonight was different. This silence wasn't empty, it was expectant. Outside, the coyotes howled again, their cries sharp and distant, cutting through the brittle night air. Jonah's hand instinctively reached for the rifle, leaning against the table. Not because of the Apache, he wasn't a threat in his condition, but because the desert had a way of turning peace into peril without warning. He listened carefully. No hoofbeats, no voices, no creaking boards. Just wind against the shutters and the slow rasp of the stranger's breathing. Jonah watched him for a long while. The firelight cast flickering patterns across the man's face, cheekbones, a scar near his jaw, a mouth clenched even in sleep. He was young, maybe mid-20s, but bore the weight of someone who had seen too much. Jonah knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror, after the war, in the eyes of men who came back broken but breathing. It was the look of survival, raw, and unspoken. For a time, Jonah fought the exhaustion threatening to drag him under. His bones ached, and hunger still gnawed at his stomach, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep. Something kept him tethered to the moment, perhaps caution, perhaps curiosity. He remembered his father's words from long ago. Don't invite trouble into your home, boy. Trouble wears many faces. But his mother's voice came louder in his memory that night. You help when you can, Jonah, even if the world says not to. And that simple act of offering his last meal, offering shelter, was now etched into the quiet like a prayer dot. Around midnight, the Apache stirred. A low groan escaped his throat, and his eyelids fluttered open. Jonah leaned forward, cautious but calm. The man looked around, confused, then winced as the pain from his wound reminded him he was still alive. His gaze met Jonah's, and for a long heartbeat they simply stared at one another. No words, no gestures, just an understanding shared across silence. The Apache moved his hand to his ribs, fingers brushing the fresh bandages. When he realized someone had tended his wounds, something shifted in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, but also suspicion. Jonah didn't blame him. In a land where kindness could be a trap, trust didn't come easily. I ain't gonna hurt you, Jonah said quietly, his voice like gravel and smoke. You're safe here, just rest. The Apache blinked slowly, lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came. Then he closed his eyes again, as if surrendering for now to the rare mercy of safety. Jonah sat back, watching the flames dance. His dog, an old mutt named Granger, had curled up near the door, not barking once, since the stranger arrived. That was strange in itself. Granger didn't take to anyone, but tonight he lay there quietly, head on his paws, as though he, too, understood something sacred had entered the home. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting silver across the desert. The wind slowed, the coyotes fell silent. The ranch, usually nothing more than a lonely patch of dust and wire, felt like the heart of something ancient, as if the spirits of the land had gathered close to watch a rare moment unfold. A wounded Apache, a weary rancher, and an unspoken bond formed through bread, water, and fire. Jonah finally allowed himself to sleep, but it was a restless, shallow sort of sleep. Dreams came, half-formed images of warriors on horseback, drums echoing through canyons, feathers spinning in the wind. In those dreams, the stranger stood tall, proud, no longer wounded, and the earth itself bowed to him. Jonah awoke just before dawn, his body stiff and his eyes gritty. The fire had burned to embers. He rubbed his hands and stood, ready to check on the man. But something pulled his attention outside, a shift in the air, a pressure unseen but heavy. He moved to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped into the dim light of morning. That's when he saw them. The air outside was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that made even the birds hush and the dust pause mid-air. Jonah stepped out onto his porch, boots crunching the cold earth. The first light of dawn split the horizon with a narrow band of silver, just enough to illuminate what stood before him. He squinted, rubbed his eyes once, twice, thinking he might still be dreaming. They were everywhere, from the edge of his rickety fence to the mesquite-covered ridge beyond. They stood, silent and unmoving, a wall of men on horseback, shoulder to shoulder, lining the land like a drawn bow. At least 500 Apache warriors, maybe more, draped in feathers, war paint, and leather, spears in hand, rifles slung across backs. Faces painted in solemn reds and earth tones. Some wore necklaces of bone or beads. Others bore scars down their chests, like war stories written on skin. Not a single one spoke. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, uncertain if he should retreat back inside or stand tall, like he had nothing to fear. He did the latter, not out of courage, but out of instinct. The kind of instinct that told a man not to show his back when surrounded by lions. He lifted his chin, arms stiff at his sides, staring out across the sea of faces. It wasn't a war party. They weren't yelling, they weren't charging, and they weren't brandishing weapons. They were simply there. And then it happened. The warrior closest to the gate, a tall, broad-chested man with eagle feathers flowing down his braid, dismounted with the grace of a shadow. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements and came to a halt, just beyond Jonah's fence. His eyes were dark as obsidian, deep as canyon water. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch, and in his hand was a long staff carved with symbols Jonah couldn't read but somehow respected. The man looked Jonah in the eye, nodded once, then sank to one knee, and like a ripple moving across a still pond, the gesture echoed outward. One by one, row after row, warrior after warrior, they dismounted and knelt, bows in their laps, rifles across their thighs, hands resting peacefully on their knees. A thunderless silence filled the valley. Not a word was spoken, not a breath wasted. It was not the silence of threat, but of reverence. Jonah's mouth went dry. He had fought in the war, seen men beg for mercy and die for less, but this was something sacred, something ancient, and he had no idea what he had done to deserve it. Behind him, the old wooden door creaked. Jonah turned to see the wounded Apache he had saved leaning against the frame, pale but standing. His shoulder was draped in a wool blanket, his ribs still heavily bandaged. And yet, he stood tall, now head high, expression calm. His eyes scanned the warriors kneeling before the ranch, and a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Pride, recognition, perhaps even sorrow. He stepped forward, limping, and stood beside Jonah. The rancher glanced at him, uncertain whether to speak. The stranger gave him a brief nod, then turned his gaze back to the sea of warriors. He lifted a hand, a small gesture, and instantly, every man rose as one. A wind stirred the dust, like the desert itself had exhaled. Then the tall warrior at the front stepped forward again and held out a bundle wrapped in deer hide. Jonah accepted it cautiously. Inside were dried herbs, 2 woven armbands, a stone-carved pendant, and a small pouch of what appeared to be fine gold dust. Not coins, not wealth in a banker's sense, but gifts that meant something far deeper. The kind of offering made not to repay a debt, but to honor a bond. Jonah understood. This wasn't charity. This wasn't fear. It was respect, and it wasn't for a ranch. It was for a man who had chosen to feed another when he could have turned him away. The sun rose higher. The warriors turned silently, mounted again, and began to retreat slowly, deliberately, their horses' hooves stirring the earth like soft thunder. Jonah stood there, in stunned stillness, a bundle of sacred gifts in his arms and the wounded Apache still by his side. What had started with a shared meal had awakened something greater than either of them could have foreseen. 4 hours after the last hoofbeats faded into the horizon, Jonah stood at the edge of his porch, the weight of the deerskin bundle still in his arms. The desert had returned to its usual hush, as if it were pretending nothing had happened. But everything had changed. He didn't need to look far to know it. The earth itself seemed to feel different beneath his boots, less like a battleground, more like a sacred place. The kind of place where history didn't just happen, it echoed, inside the house. The wounded Apache sat by the cold hearth, his breathing steadier, his eyes sharper. Jonah placed the bundle gently on the table and sat across from him, unsure of what to say. So much had passed between them in silence. So many questions burned at the back of his throat, but the moment felt too big for language. The stranger reached for the armbands in the bundle, lifting them with hands that trembled, slightly, not from weakness, but from reverence. He studied the beadwork like it told a story only he could read. Finally, his voice came low, rough, but calm. "My name is Tahoma," he said, the syllables soft, shaped by a different tongue than Jonah was used to hearing. "I am son of Hawthorne, wind and nephew to the Red Mesa chief. What you did, no white man has done for one of us in many seasons." Jonah blinked. It wasn't the words themselves that struck him, but the way they were spoken, not with accusation or sarcasm, but with quiet wonder, as if even Tahoma didn't quite believe it had happened. "I didn't do it for thanks," Jonah said finally, voice hoarse. "You were bleeding, half-starved. I just couldn't let you die out there." Tahoma nodded. "That is why they came, not because you fed me, but because you saw me." That sentence hung between them like the smoke of old fire. Jonah leaned back, absorbing it. In his life, he had seen too many people treated like shadows. Laborers, runaways, soldiers from the wrong side of a war. Some folks weren't seen until they were dead or gone. But now, sitting across from a man whose people had once been hunted across this land, Jonah began to understand that food and shelter were only the surface. It was dignity that had been offered. And that, perhaps, was rarer than bread. "They know," Jonah asked, "your people, that you were here?" Tahoma gave a faint smile. "Word travels. Smoke, drums, eyes in the hills. When a man of the desert does not return, others go searching. When they found my blood on the rocks, and followed the trail to your door, they waited." "Waited for what?" Jonah asked, already guessing the answer. "To see what kind of man you were," Tahoma said. "If you had killed me, they would have buried me. If you had ignored me, they would have taken me. But you broke bread instead, so they bowed." Jonah swallowed hard, staring down at the table. He wasn't sure whether to feel humbled or haunted. He had lived a life shaped by suspicion, taught to fear those who looked like Tahoma, who wore feathers instead of hats, who rode the hills instead of plowing the earth. And yet, no amount of upbringing had prepared him for this reality, that one quiet act of humanity had meant more than any sermon or speech ever could. "What happens now?" Jonah asked softly. Tahoma looked into the fire's dying embers before answering. "Now, you are known." Jonah chuckled dryly. "That a good thing or a bad thing?" "It depends," Tahoma said. "To some, it will make you a friend. To others, a traitor. But to my people, you are a man of honor, and that does not fade." Outside, the wind had picked up again, blowing the scent of mesquite and ash across the valley. Granger barked once, then lay back down by the door, content. Jonah stood and looked out across the now empty land, still half expecting to see shadows on the ridge, but the warriors had come and gone like ghosts. All that remained was the silence and the memory. He turned back to Tahoma. "You're welcome to stay till you heal. If you've got family, I figure you'll want to find your way back to them." Tahoma nodded, eyes soft. "In time, but for now, this place is still." They sat in the quiet again. No more words needed. The fire might gone out, but something older had been lit between them, something no man, law, or border could put out. The days that followed passed like pages in a book Jonah didn't know he'd started. Mornings came earlier than before, and the land seemed to breathe differently, almost as if it, too, had seen the warriors kneel. Nothing had been spoken of it in town, but Jonah could feel the weight of eyes every time he rode in for supplies. The ranch hadn't moved an inch, but somehow, it stood on different ground, now sacred ground. Tahoma recovered slowly, but with the patience of a man who understood pain as a companion, not a punishment. He moved through Jonah's home with quiet grace, always careful, always respectful. He repaired the chicken coop when no one asked, mended a broken gate like it was his own. He even took to brushing the horse and feeding Granger, who had taken an odd liking to him, something Jonah had never seen before. It was as if the ranch itself had accepted this new presence, this one stranger who now belonged. Sometimes at night, Jonah would find Tahoma outside, seated cross-legged near the fire pit, whispering into the flames in a language Jonah didn't understand. He never interrupted. He just watched, listened, and respected the rituals of a man who had earned his silence. On the fourth day, a small bundle was left at the gate. No sound, no visitors, just a piece of deerskin tied with a leather cord. Inside it were several painted stones, each etched with symbols. Tahoma examined them under the rising sun and said only, "They still watch." "What does it mean?" Jonah asked. "It means you are marked," Tahoma replied, "not in fear, in trust." Jonah didn't fully grasp the weight of those words, but he didn't need to. The earth around him, the quiet way animals moved, the sense of being part of something larger, it was all enough. He'd once believed that a man's worth was built on sweat and cattle and land measured by surveyors. Now he was beginning to learn there was another kind of value, one not bound to fences or coin. Tahoma began teaching him small things, how to read the clouds beyond just guessing rain, which plants healed burns, how to track an animal not by footprint but by what it disturbed in the world around it. Jonah listened more than he spoke. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one explaining the world he was being taught, and through it all, something deeper formed. Not friendship, not yet, but kinship. The kind that doesn't ask for proof or words. The kind that just is. One evening, as the sun bled across the desert in streaks of crimson and gold, Tahoma stood at the edge of the pasture, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon. "My people were not always at war," he said quietly. Jonah stood beside him. "Neither were mine." They didn't say more than that. They didn't have to. That night, Jonah sat by the fire with Tahoma and listened to a story told in fragments and metaphors, in names that had no English equivalent. It was the story of a boy who had once been lost in a canyon, left to die by a rival tribe, and who was found by a great bird who led him to water. That boy would become a warrior not through bloodshed, but through mercy. His tribe honored him not for his strength, but for his heart. Jonah looked across the flames at Tahoma, realization dawning like the first light of morning. "It was you," he said. Tahoma only smiled and added another log to the fire. They sat in the glow until the stars came out, until the desert returned to silence once more. And in that stillness, Jonah began to believe that maybe this land still had stories worth telling. Not of war, not of division, but of a rancher and a warrior, once strangers, bound now by a single shared truth. One act of kindness can echo farther than a bullet ever will. Jonah had long accepted the rough eyes of the townsfolk, but now their gazes held something different, something colder. It started subtly, a half-second longer, at the general store, a murmured word behind his back. Then one morning, when he rode into town for grain, the blacksmith, Willis Hargrove, stopped hammering mid-swing and stared, not at Jonah, at the tracks on his wagon. Apache tracks, he guessed. And word, as it always did in small towns, spread faster than wildfire. It wasn't long before Reverend Pike paid a visit. He rode up in a cloud of dust, Bible in hand, face tight as boot leather. "Jonah," he said without greeting, "you know we've always respected your privacy out here, but folks are concerned." Jonah leaned against the fence rail, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Concerned about what?" "My harvest." The Reverend sighed. "No one said anything when you skipped Sunday services, or when you refused to join the militia years back, but this talk of Apaches on your land." "They're not on my land," Jonah interrupted. "One man is recovering under my roof, that's all." "Is it?" the Reverend asked. "Because I've heard tales of warriors kneeling in your yard, of gifts left at your gate. That kind of attention can get a man killed." Jonah said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Maybe it's time this town learned there's more to a man's worth than who he fears." The Reverend didn't reply. He only looked past Jonah, toward the distant hills, where heat shimmered like smoke. "Just be careful," he said at last. "Mercy is noble, but it can turn to foolishness real fast." After he left, Jonah stood alone, the sun baking his hat, thinking of how the same land that grew wheat could also grow suspicion. The same soil that fed cattle could also rot hearts if left untended. That night, he told Tahoma about the visit. The Apache listened without flinching, though his jaw tightened. "This is the pattern," Tahoma said. "A white man shows kindness, and others believe he has betrayed his kind." "I haven't betrayed anyone," Jonah said. "I just treated a wounded man like a human being." Tahoma looked at him with something between gratitude and sorrow. "That is a dangerous thing. In a world where fear feeds men faster than bread." The next morning, a different kind of bundle lay at Jonah's gate. This one was no gift, it was a threat. A dead coyote, strung up by the legs, its belly slashed. A note nailed to the post: "You feed wolves. Don't be surprised when they circle your house." Jonah stared at it in silence. He didn't touch it. Tahoma came and stood beside him. "They will not stop," he said. Jonah turned to him. "Then I won't either." The two men burned the coyote behind the barn. Neither spoke, but the smoke that rose carried something. More than ash, it carried resolve. Later that evening, Jonah sat on his porch, rifle across his lap, not in threat, but in readiness. Not out of fear, but to protect what mattered. Tahoma sat beside him, sharpening a blade slowly, eyes scanning the horizon like he'd done since childhood. "They think you're a danger," Jonah said, "but I've never felt safer than since you arrived." Tahoma nodded. "Not because of me," he said. "Because you chose not to be alone." The wind blew soft across the porch, lifting dust, creaking the boards underfoot. Somewhere in the hills, a night bird called. Jonah looked out into the darkness and knew it wasn't the kind of night you'd forget. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because, for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to stand between two worlds and not flinch. The uneasy silence between Jonah and the town didn't last. By the second week, whispers turned into visits, angry ones. A group of 3 men rode up uninvited one afternoon, dusty from the road, each armed and heavy with judgment. The leader, Bart Cullen, ran the feed store and carried more hate than sense. His voice had always rung loud in church and louder in taverns, and now it rang sharp across Jonah's porch. "We came to speak plain," Bart said. "That Apache in your house, gonna send him back to wherever he came from. This ain't Indian land." Jonah didn't rise from his chair. "This land ain't yours to claim either, Bart. Last I checked, I paid for every inch of it." "You paid coin," Bart sneered. "But blood was spilled before you ever touched that soil. We built this town, we protected it, and we won't let you undo that with your peacemaking." "I gave a starving, bleeding man food and rest," Jonah said calmly. "That's not peacemaking. That's decency." One of the other men spat into the dirt. "Decency won't stop arrows." At that, Tahoma stepped through the doorway, silent and steady. His presence froze the air. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't speak. He only stood tall, proud, and alive. That alone shook the men. Bart took a small step back. "You let that savage inside your home?" he asked, voice faltering. "He's probably mapping your land for an ambush." "If he was," Jonah said, standing now, 500 Apache, already had the chance to take my life, and, instead, they bowed. "Did you?" That silenced the men. For a long second, they didn't know whether to threaten or retreat. Pride pushed them to stay, but fear began gnawing at the edges of their courage. "You've been warned," Bart finally said. "Next time, we won't knock." Jonah watched them ride off, dust rising behind them like a bad promise. When they were gone, he turned to Tahoma. "I reckon that's not the last of them." Tahoma nodded. "No, but it tells me something." "What's that?" "That the right path often runs through fire." That night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle near, heart quiet. The land was still, but his mind churned. With the weight of what lay ahead, what had begun as a simple act giving bread to a dying man was now the fulcrum on which the whole town seemed to tilt. And somehow, Jonah was still unshaken. The next morning, a boy arrived barefoot, no older than 12. He came not from town, but from the edge of the western mesa. Apache, like Tahoma, but younger, with a string of beads in one hand and a clay pipe in the other. He said only one word: "Message." Jonah crouched to the boy's level. "From who?" The boy pointed east. "From those who bowed." He handed Jonah the pipe and left, vanishing into the desert like wind through reeds. Tahoma took the pipe and studied it. His face grew solemn. "They know you've been threatened. They send word that you're not alone." Jonah looked out at his land, at the fences, the barn, the hills where coyotes roamed. He felt a pull, something deeper than fear or pride. It was purpose, and it was rooted not in defending himself, but in refusing to surrender the truth. This land had been won, lost, bloodied, and tamed, but perhaps it still had the chance to be shared. And maybe, just maybe, one man's stand could ripple far enough to remind others. Justice wasn't about who had the most guns, or who built the tallest church. It was about who stood up when it counted, especially when it cost something. The desert had always been a place of silence, vast, unyielding, sacred in its own way, and on that morning, it held its breath. Jonah stood on his porch, arms crossed against the chill, eyes fixed on the horizon where the light had just begun to stir. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but it was close. The sky was a deep indigo, with slivers of pale fire hinting at the sun's slow rise. All was still eerily so. No birdsong, no wind. Just the dry breath of a land older than any man who ever claimed to own it. Then he saw it, movement. First, just shadows. Then silhouettes. And then the unmistakable figures of men, hundreds of them emerging slowly over the rise. Their steps were quiet, purposeful, and perfectly aligned. There was no war cry, no noise at all. In fact, just the steady, synchronized arrival of something ancient and powerful. 500 Apache warriors, dressed in ceremonial paint and feathers, weapons sheathed, heads high, eyes locked on the lone ranch house ahead. Jonah didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't reach for his rifle. He simply watched, awestruck, as they approached like a slow-moving river of history reclaiming its voice. Tahoma stepped out beside him, now wearing his full regalia-bedded shirt, armbands, a ceremonial sash across his chest. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His people had come not for war, not for revenge, but for something deeper. When the warriors reached the fence line of Jonah's land, they stopped as one. The entire line dropped to one knee, in perfect unison. 500 men, kneeling not as subordinates, not in submission, but in reverence. A hush swept across the field. Jonah could hear his own heartbeat thudding like a drum in his chest. Then the lead warrior, a tall, weathered elder with silver woven into his braids, stepped forward and spoke in clear, formal Apache. Tahoma translated softly beside him. You gave bread to our blood. You shared warmth with one the world called your enemy. You did not see a savage, you saw a man. That vision is sacred, and so we bow not to worship you, but to honor the spirit that still remembers balance. Jonah swallowed hard. His throat was tight, his eyes damp with something he hadn't expected to feel, something beyond gratitude, beyond pride. It was something closer to recognition. Tahoma placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. They are not here to fight. They are here to show the world that mercy is not forgotten among us. The elder pulled from his sash a carved wooden staff, tipped with eagle feathers and etched with symbols that shimmered faintly in the morning light. He offered it to Jonah, holding it high with both hands. Tahoma whispered, "It is a sign of peace and protection, a tribal mark that your home and your name are now known in stories." Jonah stepped forward and accepted it. The wood was warm to the touch, as if alive. As he raised it, the warriors stood as one, fists crossed over, their chests in silent salute. Then, just as they had come, they turned and disappeared into the dawn. No words, no sound, just the wind picking up behind them, carrying their presence into legend. For a long time, Jonah stood there, gripping the staff. His porch bathed in the first true light of morning. He thought of how close he'd come to letting fear dictate his actions, of how easy it would have been to close the door, to turn away, to call the sheriff when Tahoma collapsed at his gate weeks ago. But he hadn't. And now, everything had changed, not just for him, but perhaps for something bigger than he could name. Back in town, they'd talk. They'd whisper. Some would spread lies. Others would harden in their hatred. But a few would wonder. A few might begin to see. Jonah didn't need a parade or a headline. He had something better. He had seen two worlds meet on his land, not to destroy, but to understand. And in that quiet exchange, without a single drop of blood, something sacred had been planted, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would grow.